Welcome and thank you for joining me tonight. What you are about to hear is not just another story. It is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those who stand closest to us. This is the story of Lauren Juma, a 16-year-old high school student from Humble, Texas. She was bright, full of life, and had her future ahead of her. But in April of 2022, her life was stolen in a way that shook an entire community to its core. Picture the scene. A quiet Texas neighborhood, a family home where laughter and love once filled the air. Yet, on one terrifying night, those walls became the backdrop of a tragedy so dark that even the officers who responded struggled to make sense of it. Lauren was inside that house. She wasn't alone. Her mother's boyfriend, a man she should have been able to trust, was there with her. And in the silence of that night, he made choices that would end a young girl's life forever. It began with a phone call. Lauren's voice was shaken but clear when she reached out to her mother and her sister. On the line, she whispered the words no family ever wants to hear. "Mom, he has a gun." In those few seconds, her fear crossed the wire and her family knew something was terribly wrong. Her older sister raced to the house, desperate to protect her, desperate to reach her in time. But the nightmare had already begun. As deputies approached the home, they heard the sharp crack of gunfire cutting through the night. When the door finally opened, the man inside, Henry Brisbon, a 60-year-old who had been living with Lauren's mother, surrendered. And behind him, officers found a scene that no one will ever forget. Lauren was gone. Her young life had been ended by the very man who should have kept her safe. The truth would later come out. Investigators revealed that before pulling the trigger, Brisbon had attempted to assault Lauren. A child's trust was betrayed in the most horrific way possible, and a family was left shattered, carrying scars that time can never fully heal. In this episode, we will retrace the events of that night, examine the investigation that followed, and walk through the courtroom where justice was demanded. We will hear how a mother lost her daughter, how a community mourned, and how one man's cruelty became a cautionary tale for families everywhere. But before we begin, I want to remind you, this is not just a story about one family in Texas. It is a warning. Dangers do not always come from strangers on the street. Sometimes they live under the same roof. If you think stories like this are too close to home, protect yourself by staying informed. Subscribe now. Don't be the one who ignores these warnings. Lauren Juma was just 16 years old, a high school student in Humble, Texas. Known for her bright smile and her ability to light up a room, she had dreams, ambitions, and a life that was only just beginning. Friends remembered her as caring and vibrant, someone who never failed to offer a kind word. To her family, she was more than a daughter and sister. She was the heartbeat of their home. But in April 2022, that heartbeat was silenced in the most brutal way imaginable. The man at the center of this tragedy was Henry Brisbon, 60 years old, and the boyfriend of Lauren's mother. For years, he lived under the same roof as Lauren, a presence that blended into daily life. To outsiders, he might have seemed ordinary, but those close to the family began to notice troubling behaviors. His temper was unpredictable, his mood shifts unsettling, and his presence around Lauren was beginning to raise silent alarms. Yet no one could have predicted the horrifying events that were about to unfold. On the night of April 29, 2022, Lauren's instincts told her something was wrong. Brisbon had entered her room and stood there in the dark, his behavior unusual, his silence terrifying. Feeling the walls close in around her, she reached for the only lifeline she had. Her phone. She called her mother and her older sister, her voice trembling as she explained that something wasn't right. And then she said the words that froze their blood cold. "Mom, he has a gun." In that instant, her mother and sister knew Lauren was in grave danger. Her sister rushed to the house, desperate to reach her before it was too late. The drive must have felt like an eternity, every second filled with fear, every mile weighted with the thought that her little sister's life hung in the balance. But the nightmare was already in motion. Deputies from Harris County had been dispatched to the scene. As they approached the home, the night air was pierced by the sound of gunfire. The crack of shots echoed out, forcing officers to take cover and brace themselves for the worst. When the door finally opened, It wasn't Lauren who emerged. It was Brisbon. He surrendered, stepping out into the flashing lights of patrol cars, his hands raised. Behind him, the horrifying reality was revealed. Lauren lay inside, fatally shot. Investigators later discovered that the violence didn't stop with the gunshots. Before killing Lauren, Brisbon had attempted to sexually assault her. The revelation deepened the community's shock and anger. A betrayal of trust so profound, so unforgivable, had unfolded within the walls of a family home. The very place Lauren should have felt safest became the setting of her final moments. In the hours and days that followed, grief gripped her family and the entire community. Candlelight vigils were held, tears were shed, and questions were asked. How could this happen? How could a man welcomed into a family's life turn into the source of their greatest tragedy? This episode will take you through the events leading up to that night, the investigation that followed, and the trial that brought justice. But as you listen, remember, this is not just the story of Lauren Juma. It is a reminder of how fragile safety can be when trust is placed in the wrong hands. Protect yourself, protect those you love, and stay aware. If you believe that stories like this are too close to home, subscribe now, because ignoring warnings like these could be a mistake you can't afford to make. Lauren Juma's story does not begin on the night of her murder. To understand the weight of what happened, we must first step into her world. Lauren was a teenager full of promise, the kind of girl who made friends easily and left lasting impressions wherever she went. She was described by her loved ones as joyful, energetic, and determined. She had goals of pursuing higher education, dreams of building a successful life, and the personality that drew people close to her. To her family, she wasn't just another teenager navigating high school. She was their pride and joy. Her mother saw in her the reflection of a bright future, and her sister cherished her as both a sibling and a confidant. The environment in which Lauren lived seemed on the surface to be ordinary, a quiet neighborhood in Humble, Texas, where families believed they were safe inside their homes. But hidden behind the facade of normality was a man who would become the source of their worst nightmare. Henry Brisbon, the 60-year-old boyfriend of Lauren's mother, was someone who had been trusted within the family circle. For Lauren, that trust became a deadly trap. He was supposed to be a guardian figure, an adult who ensured her safety. Instead, his presence in her life became a ticking clock, counting down to tragedy. In the days leading up to April 29, 2022, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not enough to raise alarms that a catastrophe was imminent. Brisbon had lived in the home long enough to appear as though he belonged, but underneath that veneer, there were shadows. Accounts from those who knew him suggested troubling behavior, mood swings, and signs of instability. Still, no one could have foreseen the horror that would unfold in the darkness of Lauren's room. That night, the atmosphere shifted from routine to terror in a matter of moments. Brisbon entered Lauren's room uninvited and stood there in silence. Imagine the fear coursing through her veins as she realized something was deeply wrong. Alone in the dark with a man she should have been able to trust, Lauren did the bravest thing she could. She reached out. She called her mother and her sister, her voice trembling, her words measured, but filled with terror. On the phone, she revealed the chilling truth. "Mum, he has a gun." Those words sent shockwaves through her family. Her sister immediately rushed to the home, her heart pounding as she drove, praying she could get there in time. But while she sped toward Lauren, the walls of that house became a prison, trapping the teenager with a man whose intentions had already turned violent. By the time deputies arrived, the sound of gunshots had shattered the night. When Brisbon stepped out of the house, surrendering himself to police, the nightmare was already written in blood. Inside, Lauren's body was found, her life brutally cut short. Later investigations revealed the unspeakable truth. Before ending her life, Brisbon had attempted to assault her. It was not only murder, it was the ultimate betrayal. This was the moment that turned a family's home into a crime scene, a community's trust into outrage, and a young girl's dreams into memory. Lauren's story had reached its tragic climax, but for those left behind, the fight for justice was only beginning. The hours that followed the discovery of Lauren Juma's body were heavy with shock and confusion. Neighbors stepped out of their homes in disbelief as police cars lined the street, red and blue lights painting the night in chaos. For many, it was impossible to process that a 16-year-old girl who had just been full of life hours earlier was now gone. Deputies moved swiftly, securing the scene, questioning witnesses, and collecting every piece of evidence that could help explain what had happened behind those closed doors. The man responsible, Henry Brisbon, had already surrendered. Yet his silence as he was taken into custody spoke volumes. He offered no remorse, no explanation, only the empty stare of someone who had committed the unthinkable. Lauren's family was shattered. Her mother was consumed with guilt, replaying the phone call in her mind, haunted by the thought that her daughter had reached out in desperation, only to be met with a fate she could not prevent. Her older sister, who had rushed to the house, replayed her frantic drive in endless loops, tormented by the seconds lost along the way. In their grief, both wrestled with the same unbearable question: what if they had gotten there sooner? Could Lauren have been saved? These questions would linger long after the crime, echoing in every courtroom testimony and every sleepless night. The investigation revealed the disturbing sequence of events. Before pulling the trigger, Brisbon had attempted to sexually assault Lauren. It was this discovery that transformed the case from a tragedy into a chilling story of betrayal from within. Detectives pieced together Lauren's final moments through forensic evidence, testimony, and Brisbane's own twisted actions. He had not been an intruder breaking into the home. He was someone invited in, someone trusted, someone who had exploited that trust in the most horrifying way imaginable. News of the crime spread quickly across Harris County and beyond. The community responded with outrage, grief, and disbelief. Vigils were organized where friends, teachers, and neighbors gathered to hold candles and share memories of Lauren. They spoke of her kindness, her laughter, and the dreams that would now remain unfulfilled. Each story was a reminder that Lauren was not just a victim of a crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with limitless potential. Authorities wasted no time bringing charges. Brisbon was booked for capital murder, a charge carrying the gravest weight in Texas law. His bond was initially set at $1 million, a figure later raised to $2 million after the details of his attempted assault became known. Prosecutors made clear from the beginning that this case would not be taken lightly. Every fact, every shred of evidence, every heartbreaking detail would be presented to ensure justice for Lauren. For Lauren's family, the pursuit of justice became their only anchor. Though nothing could bring her back, holding Brisbon accountable was the only way forward. As the legal system prepared for trial, the community held its breath, waiting for the day when the man who had destroyed so many lives would finally face the consequences of his actions. The legal process against Henry Brisbon began almost immediately, but it would take time before the case reached its full conclusion. In the early days after his arrest, the details that trickled out left the community reeling. Court documents described not only the fatal shooting, but also the attempt to sexually assault Lauren before her death. For prosecutors, this fact solidified the capital murder charge. For Lauren's loved ones, it was an additional wound layered upon the grief of losing her. They were not only mourning her life, but also grappling with the unimaginable cruelty she endured in her final moments. Brisbon was brought before a judge, and the initial bond was set at $1 million. Almost immediately, prosecutors argued that the circumstances of the case, the brutality of the murder, the betrayal of trust, the attempted assault, demanded a higher amount. The court agreed, raising his bond to $2 million. Though it was largely symbolic, the adjustment represented how seriously the justice system intended to pursue the case. As months turned into years, the case wound its way through the courts. Each hearing brought Lauren's family back into the orbit of the man who had stolen her life, forcing them to relive the horror again and again. The trial was delayed by procedural hurdles, motions from the defense, and the slow march of the legal system. Yet throughout it all, her mother and sister remained determined to see justice served. When the trial finally began in 2024, the courtroom became the stage for a heartbreaking confrontation between truth and denial. Prosecutors laid out their case in meticulous detail, presenting forensic evidence, testimony from investigators, and the timeline of events from that April night. Jurors heard about Lauren's desperate phone call, the chilling words, "Mom, he has a gun," and the frantic race of her sister to the house. They were shown how deputies outside heard gunfire, how Brisbon surrendered without resistance, and how inside, Lauren's body told the story of her final minutes. The defense offered little that could counter such overwhelming evidence. There was no claim of self-defense, no alternative theory that could explain away the cruelty of the crime. Instead, their strategy appeared to focus on minimizing Brisbane's intent, but it was a futile effort. Each piece of testimony only reinforced the deliberate nature of his actions. In October 2024, after hearing days of testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. They found Henry Brisbon guilty of capital murder. The sentence was swift and uncompromising. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Lauren's family, it was a measure of justice, though it could never fill the void her absence left behind. The verdict was met with relief and sorrow. Outside the courthouse, friends and community members gathered, some embracing, others shedding tears. For them, the conviction was not just about punishing Brisbane, but about honoring Lauren's memory. It was a recognition that her life mattered, that her voice had been heard, even in death, and that the justice system had stood on her side. Though the trial had ended, the impact of Lauren's story continued to ripple outward. Her name became a symbol in the fight against domestic violence and the hidden dangers that sometimes exist within families. Community leaders spoke about the need for vigilance, for stronger protections, and for open conversations about safety in the home. Lauren's story was no longer just a tragedy, it was a warning, one that her family hoped would prevent others from suffering the same fate. After the trial ended and the sentence was handed down, the courtroom grew quiet. But for Lauren Juma's family and community, the silence was heavy with grief. Justice had been served in a legal sense. Henry Brisbon would spend the rest of his life in prison without the chance of parole. But the absence left behind by Lauren's death could never be filled. The family walked out of the courthouse carrying the weight of both relief and sorrow, knowing that although the man who betrayed their trust had been punished, Lauren would never return. In the weeks that followed, the community came together in a powerful show of solidarity. Vigils were organized, with neighbors, classmates, and teachers gathering to light candles and share memories. At one memorial, friends described Lauren as vibrant, full of laughter, and destined for great things. Teachers spoke of her determination and the promise she carried with her into every classroom. For many in attendance, the realization was overwhelming. This was not just a story they had heard on the news. This was a girl they had known, a girl whose life had ended far too soon. The outpouring of grief was matched by outrage. Parents began questioning the safety of their own children, looking closer at the people they trusted to be near them. Conversations about domestic violence and hidden abuse gained urgency. Local leaders urged families to speak openly, to break the silence that often surrounds troubling behavior within the home. Lauren's story became a painful reminder that danger is not always outside the front door. Sometimes it waits within the walls we consider safe. Her mother, despite her devastation, stood at several gatherings to speak about her daughter. With tears in her eyes, she described Lauren's courage in those final moments, how even in her fear she had reached out, warning her family of the danger. She wanted people to remember Lauren, not only for how she died, but for who she was. A daughter who loved fiercely, a sister who brought joy, and a young woman whose dreams were cut short by someone who should have protected her. The case also sparked broader discussions within Texas about how the legal system handles cases of domestic violence and predatory behavior within families. Advocates called for more resources to identify red flags and support vulnerable teens. While no law could undo what had been done to Lauren, many hoped her story would become a turning point, leading to greater awareness and stronger protections for others. Years may pass, but Lauren's memory continues to live on in her community. Her name is spoken in classrooms, at family gatherings, and during quiet moments when her absence feels sharpest. For her family, every achievement she will never reach is a wound that never fully heals. Yet they carry her legacy forward, determined that her life, though short, will serve as a warning and a lesson. The aftermath of Lauren Juma's murder is not only a story of loss but also of resilience. Her community refused to let her name fade into silence. They transformed their grief into action, their outrage into awareness, and their love for her into a determination to ensure that others might be spared the same fate. Reflection on Lauren Juma's story begins with the recognition that this was more than a single act of violence. It was the unraveling of trust, the destruction of a family's sense of safety, and the silencing of a life brimming with possibility. When the trial ended and the community memorials dimmed, what remained was the reality of absence. For Lauren's mother, every morning became a reminder of the daughter who no longer walked into the kitchen, no longer called out from her room, no longer shared the small everyday conversations that form the foundation of family life. For her sister, the memory of that desperate phone call still echoed, a haunting voice that reminded her of both Lauren's bravery and her own helplessness. In reflecting on the impact, one cannot ignore how Lauren's death forced an entire community to look inward. Parents became more vigilant, questioning not just strangers, but those invited into their homes. The case highlighted an uncomfortable truth, that betrayal often comes from those who are familiar, those who are trusted, those who slip past the defenses built against outside threats. The shock was not only that Lauren was murdered, but that she was murdered by someone who lived within her family circle, someone her mother loved and believed she could rely on. This betrayal magnified the horror of the crime and forced painful conversations across countless households. Lauren's case also became part of a larger dialogue about the justice system and its ability to protect victims of domestic violence. Advocates pointed to her story as evidence that warning signs must never be ignored. They argued that awareness campaigns in schools and communities could empower children and teenagers to speak out earlier, to identify danger, and to seek help before it is too late. The hope was that by telling and retelling Lauren's story, lives could be saved and silence could be broken. For the true crime community, Lauren's case stands as a heartbreaking example of how quickly ordinary life can fracture. Her murder is not shrouded in mystery. It is a crime with clear facts, a guilty verdict, and a man sentenced to spend his life in prison. Yet it is precisely because the crime was so stark, so clear, that it resonates so deeply. There were no unknown killers, no elaborate cover-ups. There was simply a teenager in her own home, betrayed by someone who should have protected her. It is this simplicity that makes the tragedy so devastating, and it is why her story must be told again and again. As we reach the conclusion of this account, one question lingers. How do we prevent the next Lauren Juma? There is no single answer, but what is certain is that ignoring stories like hers is dangerous. These are not distant tragedies that happen in faraway places. They can unfold in any neighborhood, behind any door, in any family. If Lauren's story unsettles you, let it serve as a call to awareness. Protect yourself, protect your loved ones, and never assume safety simply because danger seems unthinkable. And if you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed, consider this: knowledge saves lives. Staying informed could be the difference between safety and tragedy. Subscribe now, and if you choose not to, then explain in the comments why, because to turn away from stories like Lauren's is to risk repeating them.